Look, today I'll just give a brief overview on a few topics of interest, what my office does, a little bit about maintenance, a little bit about bylaws, but more than anything else, I've left open quite a bit of time at the end for Q&A. I'm certain that you have got some questions. Look, feel free to fire whatever you like at me. If I don't know, I will tell you straight up, I don't know, and I'll take that one on notice and we'll get you an answer probably back via Ashley at some point, not too far in the future. As I say, that's what we'll be looking at today. Without further ado, everything that my office does is based around legislation, and for those of you who are unaware of that legislation, this is what we deal with. So, Body Corporate and Community Management Act, I'm sure you've read that many times over as light bedtime reading, and you would all be aware of which regulation module that you are after. Probably the last point there is a little bit of a curiosity. We have a few pieces of legislation which are a bit of a legislative hangover from back in the 70s and 80s. I'm not actually sure if Capital would deal with any of building units and group tiles lots. Yes, you do? Okay, there you go. Sorry, I'm just battling for space up here on the left turn. It's all good. I think it's always useful to point out some of the key legislative objectives. And these are three that I picked out that I think are probably the most important and the most relevant. So it's self-management. So the legislation is there to provide some guidance and to provide a framework, but at the end of the day, the legislation has the expectation that bodies corporate will manage their own affairs. Now, they might manage their own affairs with the assistance of a body corporate manager, but at the end of the day, it's about the body corporate making decisions in its best interest. Which leads us nicely into the second point, having some sort of flexibility. That's why we have 5 different regulation modules, because not every scheme is the same, not everyone's needs are the same, and certainly not every owner is the same. And then finally, and probably relevant to my office, ensuring that there's some accessibility to information. Information is key here. If you're informed, you have a better chance of being able to manage your own affairs. The legislation also says that our information service is there to mitigate against disputes. Now, Ashley and Co would know that whenever I do a presentation, I always like to put forward a few stats. Apart from being interesting, they actually provide a bit of context and a bit of perspective, and I'll get to that in a moment. These stats are at the end of December 2015, that no doubt they've been updated in the months since, but this gives you a bit of an overview of the size of the sector in Queensland. We have over 45,000 schemes, and I think that number of lots is now up around the 430,000 mark. And as you would expect, most schemes in Queensland fall under the standard module. And yes, those numbers do not add up. Why that's the case, I can't tell you, but the Titles Office do know that. This gives you a little bit of a breakdown about how those schemes pan out. So while you might look at the skyline of Brisbane, you can see 100-lot schemes, multi-storey schemes being constantly under construction, and you might think, well, that will comprise most of what's in Queensland. The reality is, by far, that schemes of 6 lots and under remain the vast majority of schemes in Queensland. And in fact, those 6 lot and under schemes are increasing year on year. They're probably not increasing as much as the over 100 lot schemes, but they are still increasing. And a bit of a regional breakdown, no surprise there, Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine, Moreton and Cairns. So all of those stats are all very useful, but this is where it gets put into a bit more perspective, because these are some stats about my office. So in 2014-2015, we had around 1,300 dispute resolution applications and about 28,000 client contacts, and there's just a few more disputes there. So, what does that all actually mean? Does that mean that my office is doing such a bang-up job that everyone's happy and there are absolutely no problems? Or does it mean that Capital is doing such a fantastic bang-up job that there are no problems out there? Both of those are potentially true, but there are probably some more accurate answers, which is probably that a lot of people would not even know my office exists. And the other, probably most accurate thing to say is that most bodies corporate in Queensland are chugging along just fine, not in strict compliance with the legislation, but because there are no problems, they don't have any recourse to get any assistance. That's probably the reality. So we move on then to the information service in my office. So it's, as I say, it's provided for under the Act that my office will exist and will provide an information service. We give information about the Act and all 5 modules. We don't give information about those schemes under the Building Units and Group Titles Act. So if you happen to be in that situation, sorry, we can't actually assist you. All of our staff can give information about all of the regulation modules, so there's no differences between the information officers in my office. They're all there to give information about all aspects. When you ring through, if you don't happen to know which module you're under, we'll always work from the assumption that you're under the standard module. That's just the easiest way to do things. So these are the methods by which we deliver our information. Many of you, I'm sure, would be familiar with our 1800 number and also our email address where you can email through inquiries. Just a few stats on that. Most calls get returned within the hour. I think, in fact, the callback time at the moment is probably around half an hour. The average call duration is more or less 7 minutes. That's average. I actually listen to some of those calls as part of my ongoing training, and I know that some of them go for 30, 40 minutes, which is never an easy thing for the info officer to be able to hold concentration for that long, but there you go, that's what they're there for. It's up to 14 business days for a written response to come back, so if ever you've got an urgent inquiry, if you need something quite quickly, you're always better off to ring in the first instance. We will shortly be launching our online inquiry form, which will take away the need for you to email the generic email address. You'll just go through the form, it will ask you in what capacity you're asking your question, and that will enable us to give you some much more targeted information. And then, of course, our website. Always important to say, of course, what we don't do. So don't give legal advice. We don't give interpretation. Certainly we can't interpret the meaning of bylaws or contracts. Those two are quite common queries to our information service on a daily basis. We're not a complaints handling body and an enforcement agency, so it's quite typical for people to come to my office and say, I would like to make a complaint about insert person here, and that's not something that we do. Neither are we enforcement agency, so we don't enforce our own orders. That's up to the individual. It's important to say all of those things because it actually can save a bit of time for people who have those kinds of inquiries. And so the website, which I'm sure you've all got bookmarked and you're looking at every day for helpful information, there are all the services that are available there, and that website's changed over the last 12 to 18 months. The same information is still there, it's just in a slightly different format. So, the thorny topic of maintenance. When you're in my office and you have a question about maintenance, you will always be asked the question, what format plan are you under? Because there are differences depending upon which format plan you're under. So, if you do have a question, you're always much better off to know the answer to that in the first instance. That's how we were able to help you. I can say that maintenance responsibilities are definitely the #1 topic that our office receives. Who is responsible for? Insert maintenance responsibility here. And then from that point, our dispute service, we get a lot of disputes about maintenance as well. So this is just a bit of an overview here. The building format plan was previously known, and probably some people still know it as building unit plan. You can read the definition there for yourself. Defines land, including structural elements of a building, including, for example, floors, walls and ceilings. I think sometimes you might be aware of the definition that pretty much anything from the centre centre outwards of the lot is individual responsibility in that case. And here are some useful pieces of information that go with that. Shared utility infrastructure, split framework, financial structures, like a slab, roofing structures, doors, windows, fittings, balustrades. Look, that's not meant to be an exhaustive list by any means, and indeed I can assure you it is not an exhaustive list by any means. The number of variations that my office gets on that list every day about who is responsible for what is long and varied and complex, but we will be able to get there eventually, so long as you know which plan you're under. And again, look, I won't go into too much detail there about the format plan itself. You can read through those definitions as we go along, or as you go along. Just a quick comment about utility infrastructure. Again, it's a query that we get frequently in the office. The legislation is quite clear on this. All three elements must actually be satisfied. So even if two of them are and the third one isn't, then it's not utility infrastructure. All three of those things. The and is emphasised here. So there's no option, it must be 1, 2 and 3. As we say there, if one or more of these does not apply, then it's body corporate responsibility, but of course there must always be an exception, and the exception is a hot water system and air conditioners supplying only one lot. That's actually this particular one, very common query that my office receives. I know I'm talking a bit quickly, but that's okay because I much prefer to have time at the end for Q&A, so bear with me on this. The thorny issue of pets and enforcing bylaws. I can say that bylaw disputes take up an enormous amount of time in my office, not necessarily just pets, although we do handle a lot of pet disputes, but we handle a lot of bylaw disputes about vehicles, about parking, not so many about noise, and then a few other issues as well. Most bylaw disputes will be conciliated through my office in the first instance, and indeed conciliation is made for a bylaw dispute because it's about trying to get parties to a point where they can get a workable agreement together and then move forward, hopefully, fingers crossed. Just a word about bylaws then. The best way to think of bylaws, I mean the legislation spells it out quite clearly, but think of bylaws as a way of trying to regulate conduct in a scheme. They're not meant to prohibit, they're meant to regulate. Why is it that legislation tries to regulate someone's conduct? Well, when you think about it, living in a community title scheme is very different to living anywhere else. If you're living on freehold, you can pretty much do as you please, with some restrictions and exceptions, of course. When you're living in, say, high-density community title scheme, your conduct has an immediate impact on the people around you. That's why bylaws are actually there, to try and regulate that conduct so that the impact of that can actually get lessened to a reasonable point. Pets. What I can say is that pet disputes are emotional, difficult and challenging. When I first started the job about nearly 18 months ago now, one of the first things I did was sit in a number of conciliation sessions just to get a feel for what was happening. One of the first ones I sat in was a pet dispute. And so I rock up thinking, oh, this is going to be quite a pleasant discussion and there'll be some reasonable assumptions about what this dog can and can't do. Probably within about half an hour of the session starting, the parties were ready to leap across the table and throttle each other, to the point where the session had to be stopped, people had to be separated. One party, the person who wanted the dog on the scheme, said, even if they now grant me permission for the dog, I'm not sure I want to keep it there because I'm afraid of what will happen to the dog given what's happened in this session. It was from that point that I realised that pets were not going to be an easy issue. They continue to not be an easy issue. And look, the reason for that's pretty simple. Pets, by their nature, provoke strong emotions one way or the other. Whether you're pro-pet or anti-pet, there's not usually any point in between. You're usually one or the other. Both points of view are equally valid. It's a tough issue to deal with. Just a couple of other points there. We increasingly get calls from people saying, has the law changed in this area? I understand the law about pets has changed in this area. No, it hasn't changed at all. There are a lot of media reports about pets because it's an interesting issue, provokes a lot of emotion, but the law has not changed. Our office has not changed the way it deals with pet disputes. Nothing of that nature. Nothing's changed in that way. There is also no such thing as a blanket law about pets or a blanket approach to pets. Each dispute is always considered on its merits. It's true that our adjudicators assess things on a precedent basis, and so what has happened in relation to one pet is generally the thinking that will carry its way throughout. But as I say, each case is considered on its merits. So look, just a few points to be aware of here. The situation with pets will always be governed by the relevant bylaw. It's quite common in most cases for there to be a bylaw that says a pet can be kept on approval by the committee, and the committee is absolutely in a position to put some conditions on the keeping of that pet. The committee's approval with conditions is actually the way in which the committee exercises a bit of control about pets, and I'll try and emphasise this point every time I do a presentation, even if there's a feeling that you would rather not have pets on the scheme. By putting some conditions on keeping the pet, that's how you exercise a bit of control. The instant that the pet, and by definition its owner, stops complying with those conditions, the committee has some grounds to do something about it. And in most cases, in fact the vast majority of cases, the owner or the occupier will go out of their way to ensure that those conditions are met. So for committees who are a bit iffy about approving a pet, conditions are one of the ways in which you get to exercise a bit of control. A couple of other points to mention. We frequently get inquiries about type of pet. Is such and such, can we ban such and such a breed? We understand that such and such a breed has a violent history, or they're known to do X, or they're known to do Y. To which my response is, well, let's think about dogs as an example. Dogs bark. That's just the nature of the dog. I know some breeds don't technically bark, but dogs bark. All dogs have the potential to bite at some point. Again, that's the nature of the beast. Fluffy may well be the most loving dog in the world, but there's nothing to suggest that Fluffy may not bite someone at some point. The bottom line is that when a dispute comes, it's about considering that pet in particular. It's not about that breed, it's not about the potential for that pet, it's about that particular pet. Has that pet been a problem elsewhere? That usually is what's at issue. It's not about whether or not that pet has some really strong potential to do something wrong, it's about has it actually done anything wrong. Same with breeds as well. Whether or not it's been declared a dangerous breed, or whether or not it's thought that that breed is too big to be living in that small lot, it's about that particular pet. Not about the potential, it's about that particular pet at that particular point in time. And following on from what I just said, if the pet becomes a nuisance and one of the conditions is breached, the pet owner may be required to remove the pet from the scheme. We do get applications to issue an order to remove a pet from the scheme. It does happen. And as I say, as it says there, the committee may do that, or a conciliation adjudication application may actually do it as well. A couple of points to be aware of. Is the decision of the committee to refuse permission reasonable? The Act says the committee has a legal obligation to act reasonably in every case. Look, what's reasonable will differ on a case-by-case basis. So just harking back to the point I made earlier about there being no such thing as a blanket ban, that is true. On the flip side of that, adjudicators' orders have consistently held that any bylaw which says that there must be prohibition on pets generally will be found to be invalid. Generally. I stress the generally bit. There are actually one or two instances where it's been found in favour of not having the pet on the scheme, but they've been some very specific instances, usually to do with allergy or a specific medical condition.